Yeah, it's kind of, it seems maybe at first sight like a kind of unlikely combination, Rubens and Sorolla. Maybe it's hard to think superficially of two painters who are more different, but actually there was this weird moment when I'd just gone to Madrid a couple of years ago and I'd been to see the Sorolla house, and I came back and I was at a lecture up in the hills near Settignano here. And has anyone been to the Sorolla house? Put your hand up if you've been to Madrid and been to the Sorolla house. Okay, yeah, a couple of you. Yeah. And one of the things when you go there, you realize is that this man was someone who was incredibly busy, incredibly successful, but he built this kind of paradise to work in. And he wanted everything within that world, whether there was his family, but also all the objects that came into that world were perfect. They were beautiful. They had a sense of aesthetic. They had a sense of purpose. And this lecture was about a salt cellar and 3 teaspoons that Rubens had made for his house. And there were 25 letters between Rubens and the guy making the spoons, with Rubens saying, like, I want the spoon, the hole to be a little bit deeper, the handle has to be changed, the angle isn't quite right. No, do it again, this still isn't good enough. And like everything that came into his house, he wanted to be a work of art. He didn't, this guy was so busy. Rubens was a diplomat, a classical scholar. And so when he was painting, in the bits that he could control, he wanted everything to be absolutely according to his vision. And I just sort of felt these two people are actually more similar than I realized, not just as kind of control freaks, but people who they had their family life, they had their painting life, and they wanted that world to be, protected as far as possible. And there was everything that was formal and outside, and then there was this perfect world that they made for themselves. These are the two people. I think we kind of know what they look like. And even here, I thought this is kind of interesting that, again, they seem superficially, again, so different, these paintings. They're actually quite similar. Think about the position they're in, the use of the white collar, even the lighting of the head. Okay, this one's got a more kind of modern and sense of geometric background. But again, actually, the sort of the role of this shape to this one gives us this movement. And there's kind of a similar thing happening over here. He's got a hat, he hasn't. But actually, for all the superficial differences, they're kind of speaking the same language. I think particularly the idea of the pose in 3/4, the head this way, and the white collar. It's kind of interesting how, like, in the end, these two different painters, they never met. Sorolla obviously knew Rubens's work. Rubens, unless there's something very freaky going on, has never seen a Sorolla painting in his life. And they're also famous, they're famous, let's say Rubens, this is the Marie de Medici cycle in Paris. This was a commission of 21 paintings. To give you a rough idea, every painting is about 3 meters tall. Some of them are about 4 meters tall, some are 3 meters wide, some are 7 meters wide. There was a period of about 8 years where, not even including this commission, so just think how many, it takes us, 5 weeks to paint one person. So he did all this in 2 years. And in the space of 8 years, he painted 64 altarpieces, one of those commissions had 39 separate paintings in it. In addition, he was also brokering royal marriages, ending wars. He brokered the peace between Spain and England in 1630, like single-handedly, translated documents from Latin into French and English and also into Spanish. And some of them are still regarded as like the translation. So he did, as well as painting things like this. This is Sorolla's great series in Spain. It's called A Vision of Spain. It's basically Sorolla going round the regions. And this was his project for Charles Huntington, who was one of his great patrons later on. So these are kind of the grand projects they did. And we're not really going to talk about that this evening. We're going to think about something slightly different. They both painted royal portraits. This is Philip IV. This is the guy that Velázquez painted. And this is Rubens painting him. This is Sorolla's portrait of Alfonso XIII. If you're ever in Seville and you want a fancy drink, you have to go to the Alfonso XIII hotel. It's got this beautiful courtyard in the center. So they did royal portraits as well. Also, they're both painters that studied the past, the tradition they came out of so carefully. So Rubens, at the age of sort of 50, 55, when he's the most famous painter in the world, went to Spain to go and copy Titian. I always think it's one of the really sort of beautiful lessons in humility. So at the age of 55, he still sees himself as a student. So this is Titian on the left, Adam and Eve, and then the Rubens on the right, and they hang together now in the Prado, so you can see them there. He did a number of copies. I mean, like there are about 7 or 8 of this one, and also the Poesia that he did. It's interesting how he changed certain things. You can see the body position here, things like a parrot going in. Rubens is always kind of just like a harvest festival. You know, there's just so much, like there's so much form, there's so much stuff, there's so much color. You know, there's more fruit in this one, a few more leaves and so on, or a few less leaves in certain places. This is probably kind of his wife as well. We're going to come to that in a minute. I often ask people which one they prefer. So if you prefer the Titian, just put your hand up. Yeah, me too. And if you prefer the Rubens, yeah. I mean, technically it's probably a better painting, but I love the dignity and the awkwardness and of this moment on the left. I don't know. I mean, it's I wouldn't say it's apples and pears because it's so. This wouldn't exist without this, which I think is why I prefer the one on the left.
What I like about the Rubens is the fact that in the Titian is clearly not a negative moment, but a moment of drama that we don't know how it's going to be resolved. Where the Rubens keeps optimism. Well, we'll be fine no matter what, no? With the parrot and the fruit. So it's more like a Mozart. It's just fun. Like, yeah, we did something bad, but it was a great time, kind of thing.
Yeah, even look at the tree. I mean, here the tree is so stark. And Rubens just, even the tree has to be a little bit softer, a little bit kinder, a little bit more kind of rhythmical. Like he can't leave this. I mean, Titian, if he wanted to, he was perfectly capable of putting little branches on, little leaves on the tree, but he wanted this severity. And Rubens wants to give you something happier, something kinder. And this is Sorolla copying. So this is, again, this is a few, last trimester I think it was, we looked at, Velasquez in the 19th century, and it was all about how Sargent, turned up in the copybook in the Prado, I think it was 9 times. For Sorolla, it was kind of the same. I mean, for some of his work, and we'll see that, he's very much not relying on the old masters. He's relying on, let's say, an impressionist or even post-impressionist like concept of light and lighting, and even photography through his father-in-law was a huge influence on him as well. But he did also study, and he would have seen also seen Rubens' paintings. He went down to Toledo. This is the famous bridge in Toledo, and we'll see a portrait as part of this trip as well in a second. So this is the town that gave us El Greco, or where El Greco did his most kind of significant work. So Sorolla would have known this painting growing up. This is Rubens' Three Graces, and we're heading now towards what the point of this lecture is really, which is portraits of like intimate paintings, essentially. For all of you who are, either leaving or going to be, let's say, not here in sort of 3 or 4 months, and right now we give you your subject matter to an extent. That you have to do a still life, you have to do a portrait. Quite soon you have to give yourself your own projects or find them. And I think one of the interesting things we see in both of these artists is how often they use the world around them and the fact that they created a world around them to give them their subject matter. So this is actually Rubens' wife, 3 ways. When you look at the head, this is his second wife, Hélène Formand. He's classicized her a little bit, but there's this famous idea like the Rubensian type. What I think is so obvious when you actually look at this painting, when you see this in the Prado, if we go and see it in the Prado, just the fact that he loved every inch of that body. It's like it's a celebration of his wife and of her flesh and her appearance. It isn't necessarily a particularly spiritual painting. The Three Graces isn't necessarily the most spiritual idea. It's just the idea is just to revel and enjoy in human beauty. And here it's about, let's say, human fertility being mixed with the fertility of the natural world. There's a lovely quote from Constable talking about Rubens' landscapes. He said, it always seems to be the moment when it's just rained. He said, the landscape's at its most fertile, it's most reflective, it's most shiny, it's most lush, it's most alive. He said, you can imagine all the frogs are suddenly out, the trees are a little bit wet and shiny, and everything's about to sort of give birth again. And so I think this whole painting really is on one level it's a bit creepy. Rubens was quite an old man. His second wife was a sort of a teenager almost. So maybe in the 21st century there are parts of that we find that make us understandably a little uncomfortable. But when you see the paintings and you see the way that he presented her in other paintings as well, his love, his admiration, almost his awe of her, I think he worshipped her almost like a goddess. This is another painting Sorolla would have almost certainly seen when he came to Italy. And right now it's a painting in the Palazzo Pitti that's quite high up and no one really notices. Sometimes it's very easy to walk past it amongst the thousands of other pictures in the way the Palazzo Pitti is hung. This gives us a clue as to how important it used to be seen. So this is a painting by Zoffany, who's a German-English painter. And this is kind of the grand tour. So just after Sorolla was, before Sorolla came. And this is the tribuna in the Uffizi's. This is where they have, you can't go in there anymore. So they have that beautiful mother of pearl ceiling and everything else. And it gives us an idea of what they really valued then. So you can see the Raphael Tondo over here. There's a Carracci painting. But up here is the Rubens. And it's a self-portrait of Rubens with his brother. And then there's Lipsius, and I can never remember the name of the fourth guy. It's basically a group displaying, to some extent, showing Rubens and his brother as part of the intellectual life in Antwerp at the time. So this is Seneca up here. Two of the portraits, Rubens and this guy, are both alive. The two in the center had actually died at this point. So you've got the two flowers that are open, the two flowers that are closed, symbolizing the dead and the alive, and then the still life down here. And it's interesting. So I mean, for Rubens being part of this, let's say, the intellectual elite at the time, this life of movement, of ideas, was incredibly important to him, and it's something that he took part in. Interestingly, Sorolla was kind of the same. His father-in-law was a photographer, a very successful photographer, and inevitably photography at the time was a relatively new technology. And Rubens was, as well as with his father-in-law, was also involved and had a number of friends who worked in the world of science. This is the painting called Research. And a number of Rubens's commissions came in that world. But no, this is going back to this idea of family. So this is young Rubens and his first wife, Isabella Brandt. It's called the Honeysuckle Bower. And again, it's this idea of their union in nature. So we're moving in back now, and most of the rest of the lecture is going to be focused on this idea of family. I did a course on Rubens at university, and one of the questions we were given the top half of this picture, and the question was, what color are Rubens's breeches? And you had to remember from sort of seeing this lecture 2 or 3 months before, and as a result, whenever I look at this painting now, it's quite a bold choice for the lower part of a painting. It's clearly kind of something of a dandy. But in the center of all this kind of, and this is the thing with Rubens that's so important, in amidst all this kind of finery, these costumes, these, did he really have such muscular calves? Who knows? There's this possibly more beautiful than the faces is this gesture of the two hands meeting, almost right in the center of the canvas. And that's something that Rubens, again, a bit like Ramiro was saying with the Adam and Eve, every time there's this, really actually very profound and very touching human element at the heart of every picture. So for all the rhetoric, if you want to call it that, rhetoric isn't speaking in the normal sense of I might speak, it's the idea of a performance. So in the midst of all this rhetoric or persuasion, there's also just this very quiet moment. And for me, that's the beauty of Rubens. And if you can look past all that other stuff, these rough collars, imagine wearing that every day. I think it was about 1625 they went out of fashion. She died just before that, unfortunately for her. But in the midst of all of this kind of absurdity, there's this. Okay, so if you've been to the Sorolla house, another place I think that's really interesting to see about how an artist made a world for himself. This is the outside of Rubens's house in town, in Antwerp. There's the 19th century idea of the artist in Montmartre, in the garret, sort of Zola or La Bohème, and you're kind of burning your furniture. Rubens was not up for that at all. He was not interested. So this is the outside of his townhouse. This is the courtyard inside. And actually what we see today is a 3/4 model. The real thing was actually almost half as big again. And then there was a separate building for his studio as part of it. I mean, roughly they've been trying to work out, because Rubens as he was the court painter, he didn't have to, like everyone else, declare his assistants and his workers. He was exempt from paying any tax. That also helps. All the things that all of us have to do. Roughly these days, if you sell a painting, it's just worth thinking about this. Okay, half of it goes to the gallery, half of what's left goes in tax. Rubens didn't have to worry about a gallerist, and he didn't have to worry about tax. Whoop-de-doo. Suddenly those 64 commissions, and here you go. And this is the garden, or part of the garden in his townhouse. And this is where you really start to hate this guy, maybe. This is a big landscape of the place outside Antwerp. This is his country house over here, and actually it's currently for sale. Ta-da! So about 25 minutes outside Antwerp, and if any of you got, I think it's about 8 million euros just floating around in your back pocket, you can buy Rubens's country house. Yeah, but I think it's really interesting. It speaks to something else, which is this thing, just like Sorolla, in the end, he was saying, okay, I've got all these other jobs I have to do. I have to be a diplomat. I'm a classical scholar. I'm involved in the life of the city. He was kind of on the council as well. But I also want to make these barriers so that when I'm working, there is no distraction. There's nothing, not just distraction in terms of time and people, but there's nothing ugly around me. He couldn't contemplate the idea of, and once he got beyond the wall of his house, he didn't want anything kind of banal. And it's that, and Sorolla shared that dedication actually to that. When you go to his house and you see the teapot he used, and he was friends with Tiffany in America. He did that beautiful portrait of Tiffany in the garden. He wanted everything in his house to be beautiful. And it's just that like remorseless sense of quality. They were nice guys, but they also had this idea of like, if this object or that person isn't helpful, they don't get beyond a certain place in their life. And that takes a certain almost sort of psychopathic approach to those things. And if you go to the Sorolla's house in Madrid, so this is part of his garden. And there's another angle of it over here. So just thinking about these columns. And so again, he was making this partly as a place where he'd go and have lunch and everything else. And Ramiro's, you can ask to see it afterwards, has got a really nice book. And there are photos of Sorolla painting in his garden. It's a pretty big painting for a kind of an outside. This is like a huge sketch. I mean, this painting's like 1 meter by 80. So often we think of these little outside sketches as quite small things. This is a big painting. And again, a little bit like his self-portrait earlier, the first thing we look at is, okay, it's the garden and there are all these flowers. And as you squint down and just sort of simplify it, you really start to see how this, let's say, pretty scene has been turned into something, especially in terms of light and dark. It's actually really dynamic and energetic. I think that's what I get from this. It's not just a kind of a pretty thing of all the little details. It's his idea of, think of the places he didn't go into detail. If you look at this area or up here, even if it's a mass of white, here we have little bits that are picked out a little bit more carefully. And so we have this kind of almost like a backward C, an inverted C shape rhythm of movement, blocked off by this darker shape coming round. And so this, let's say, very restful scene, and we still get a sense that it's restful in terms of the way that it's arranged tonally, actually has tremendous strength and energy. He also used the garden to paint portraits. I mean, these are almost life-size figures, by the way, in this painting. It's a big picture. This is his wife wearing white, almost like it's her wedding dress. And then the two daughters who are wearing blue. I think this is Maria on the right and Elena in the center. Interesting, in so many Renaissance pictures, there's a sleeping dog. Like a quiet little dog symbolizing a kind of discreet loyalty, I guess. I don't think it's an accident that it finds its way into this painting either. And it's that wonderful ability that people like Sorolla, Sargent, sometimes Zorn have, where they paint pictures which can superficially deceive us as being modern, but the more you study them, the more you realize they're actually rooted in maybe something slightly older and more significant as well. This isn't just turn up and paint what I see. There's a lot of arrangement, both of nature and then decision-making on the canvas as well. But and so we're in sort of, we're going to concentrate for a little bit on Rubens' world, and we'll go back to Sorolla's world a little bit at the end of the lecture. And this is the outside of his house, so you can see it's a pretty, I'd imagine this came later, but it's a really substantial building. And then when you go inside, there's these amazing, these are the skylights here, big north-facing windows for another type of light. And you can see, again, if you look along here, again, just the quality of the objects that he chose to have around him. Downstairs, they have all the ceramics and other things, beautiful tiles everywhere. And of course, it's been restored a little bit, but again, you get a sense of how, the quality of the construction of this space as well. And in the museum, there are kind of, bigger paintings. A lot of them are actually very much about the family. And then other sort of really famous ones, like the boy leading the horse along the beach. I think the other thing I've found, and this is part of the reason for this lecture as well, is that almost every time I talk to students, like everyone loves Sorolla. And then with Rubens, people are a little bit sort of, some people really like him, or I kind of get it, or I completely don't. And actually part of this evening is just to show off, I think, how wonderful Rubens is. So this is a painting that's completely not part of the lecture as a theme. This is just like my privilege of putting these together, is I get to put in what I like. This is a painting in the Maurits house in Holland, and we're just going to look at a series of close-ups. And this is really just a way of saying Rubens is, if you haven't really noticed him before or haven't thought about him before, just think about how good this guy is. It seems like quite a casual scene. It's a much older lady and a younger girl with the candlelight. This comes from Leonardo. He wrote in his notebooks about how the best way to explain youth is to have it next to old age and vice versa. And you can see in Leonardo's sketchbooks, he often had these kind of grotesque heads. If you want light, have dark. So we can move in. And you start to see, like, this guy could really paint. Go even closer. Because I think sometimes when we see these in museums, or especially online on a small screen, you lose that sense of touch. And Rubens, as a draftsman and also as a painter, had this amazing hand. I mean, his handwriting was also incredibly beautiful. And we get the sense of just the liveliness of his touch here when you see it close up. The other thing he did that I think is really, particularly if you talk to restorers or people that work with 17th century pictures, almost no one in the history of art has produced paintings that are technically as durable as his. So a few of them have to be cleaned, obviously, if they're in a bad state, but the quality of his materials, the grounds, the support, the pigment and the oil, means that very few of them have deteriorated unless they've been damaged, as it were, like deliberately, but they haven't damaged them themselves. Like the paint itself is, the colors have stayed, the brushstrokes have stayed. There's very little flaking or anything like that. So this is the smoother head of the younger girl. Just think of all the different types of edges. And if you go back, okay, it's soft, but it's also unbelievably structured. And we're going to kind of get into her head, and we're going to go to sort of closer and closer and closer and closer. Just keep your eye on something like that. If you haven't got enough apps on your phone, the Maritz House has an app, and you can go around the whole museum and zoom in on any picture up to almost this level. And it's got some of the best Van Dycks, Rubenses, it's got a beautiful Vermeer, very famous Vermeer, the girl with the pearl earrings in the Maritz House. They did it for COVID, but they're sort of keeping it on. And you just think of the way that, like the casual way that this is painted, and then we can go out again. So I said, part of this is just a way of saying, like, let's think about Rubens a bit more, because Ramiro's thing, he gives us so much joy on a narrative level. He's one of the kindest, most optimistic painters you can possibly imagine, the most humanistic painters. But also just on a technical level, there aren't that many painters in the history of art who've ever produced a surface like that. I can't think of anyone in the 19th century, to be honest.
And also so well kept.
Yeah.
I mean, even this close up, you don't see scrapings or splitting, nothing. It's amazing the state that they are.
Yeah. The guy in the studio next to me is a restorer. He said he's restored, I think, 6 Rubens paintings in the last 15 years. He said he's never found a single brush hair in the painting. Which I think is also quite an interesting way of looking at it.
It's interesting also to mention that when you said before he was painting 80 paintings and then he was not alone.
No,
so
he had a huge studio room exactly. So
and then everybody was trained to look just like amazing.
So this is his first wife, Isabella, and this is we're about to touch on the argument that Ramiro said. So we're going to see. This is in the Uffizi. This is a close-up of the portrait of his wife, Isabella Brandt. It's one of my favorite mouths. I mean, I think it's just so subtle. I mean, compare the two corners, or just like the two nostrils even. Obviously, the eyes are more similar, but I think just the way that he handles those forms, and again that idea of life. This is the drawing for it. Also, a kind of miraculous mouth. Again, it's that thing where he couldn't make a boring shape. Like his hand wouldn't let him. And so, this is something Ramiro just mentioned. He had this studio. So perhaps his most celebrated pupil was a painter who then had a long relationship with the UK, someone called Van Dyck. So Van Dyck painted this, we think, at the age of about 19. That's the close-up of the head when he was in Rubens' studio. Van Dyck was one of like 25 kind of full-time assistants who was there. There was a guy who was there to paint the animals, Snyders. Rubens had 5 people just to produce etchings. So before Instagram, before PR, public relations stuff, like how do you publicize and promote your work? You have to produce reproductions. And so he found the best etcher in all of Europe, who luckily came from about 10 miles away, called Vorstemans. And he said, yep, you come here and your main job is just to literally make etchings and engravings of my paintings. I haven't got any of those here. If we went back to the Three Graces, Bruegel painted a lot of the fruit and everything else around it. So a little bit like in Rome at about the same time where Bernini said, okay, anyone who's any good at sculpture, I just employ them. It means they get to do amazing jobs, but it also means there's no danger of anyone competing for the same work. So this is his 19-year-old assistant. So Van Dyck's real job was to paint the heads, more or less, every time. He could do other stuff too, but a lot of the time he would actually mention him in the contract saying, I have this unbelievably good pupil called Van Dyck. He can paint a head as well as I can, and he'll do the heads on all these paintings. Because if you're trying to paint 39 pictures for one big altarpiece inside a year and a half, 2 years, you need a bit of help. So this is Van Dyck painting his wife, which is also a sign of how intimate their relationship was. And when Van Dyck left to go to Italy in 1623, by that point Rubens had already bought 10 of his paintings, which again is a pretty clear sign that you recognize that he's doing something right. And so the way it would work in the studio was very often Rubens would do a sketch like this. And they got in Jordaens, who was one of his pupils, he saw this being made, and apparently this was painted by Rubens in about an hour and a half just from the imagination. There was no model, nothing, which I find quite depressing. When you just think of the quality of the touch, the color relationships, the design of everything. And then Rubens would give this to his studio, and they would enlarge it and stick it onto a wall or a canvas and go from there. And if necessary, Rubens would come back and touch it up or leave it, according to how much money he was being paid, basically. I'll give you a rough idea of how prestigious his studio was. I think it was 1615. He rejected 100 people. And he would get paid. They didn't pay, they would pay him to be in that studio, and he would still get the money from the commissions. So they worked out that Van Dyck earned him about 100 guilders a day in the time he worked for him, and 100 guilders was roughly sort of half of a good annual wage for a lawyer in those days. That's how much work they were getting through. But also he learnt off Van Dyck. So this is Van Dyck's picture of a woman called Marie de Tassis on the right. And then this is Rubens' portrait of his own wife and son done a few years afterwards. And I think it's really interesting how this time, obviously the master taught the pupil, but then actually it echoed back the other way. I think obviously this is it's a bigger painting, it's got a more complex background, but it's also about the fashion of the clothing. But if you think of the pose, the way the hands are related, and everything else, I think it's pretty obvious that he's taken the gesture from his most talented pupil. So again, this is also the idea behind this kind of place, is that we're actually learning from each other. We come here and we get inspiration, energy, and we think, wow, that's a really clever idea, and we can steal it. You all learn from each other as well. So this is how these places are meant to work, which is this kind of echo and conversation between two artists. Okay, Rubens, again, learning off Titian, flipping it around. Interestingly, we're about to get back to Sorolla. This is a painting of his wife. And she tried to have this destroyed on Rubens' death. And the studio people said, no, this is such a great painting. We can't let you destroy this. We have to keep it for posterity. And so she wasn't able to get hold of it. So it survived today. It's in Vienna, in the Kunst. I can understand why, if you're the subject to this painting, you would perhaps not want it to be put in public. But at the same time, I think we're all probably grateful. If you go and see this particular picture in Vienna, we're probably very grateful. And actually, I think the one on the left, the Titian's in Vienna as well, I think. Okay, so this is a painting that Sorolla did of his wife, and she knew at the time that he was going to try and sell this picture. So they had a slightly different relationship in that way. I mean, this was painted, I think, very obviously with the knowledge of the Velázquez, the Rokeby Venus. I mean, it's flipped around the other way. The other thing that's really interesting is Sorolla went to London to see the Velázquez, and he wrote his wife this very sweet postcard saying, I'm here in London, the weather's terrible, can't find anything to eat, it's really expensive, so the same complaints that people still have today when they go to London. But he also said, I've seen this Velázquez painting, and it's like the hottest it's the nicest piece of meat in town. And they had this amazing rapport between the two of them all their life with letters. Writing letters to each other. Again, this is before mobile phones, before transport was so much slower. And actually, part of the beautiful thing in the book that Ramirez got is this record of the letters. I don't know whether you want to mention a few other moments from those now.
Yeah. So the letters the book I have here at the moment is a book about photograph. As Tom said, Sorolla's father-in-law was a famous photographer, and so you're trained with him illuminating the photographies. That means that he will put color on the photos and paint over them, and that kind of old style fashion. Sorolla will go away from his wife also when the kids were born. And they hated that. He hated that, but they understood, I need to go and work. The usual day, he will wake up. Most nights he slept really badly. And he kind of always said, I slept bad. Rarely he slept well. And then he wake up very early, around 7. And then he would write to her. And he always said, I'm sitting on my bed. He could see outside the sea. So he's already projecting. He's waking up. It's like he's already working. He would write to his wife, the weather is so, this, that. And what is beautiful also, he describes the colors of the day. Every day he says, the sea today is silverly gray. The sky right now on the bottom is orange and the top is cerulean blue. Like he talks like that to his wife, which I find is beautiful. He's always describing the way he sees the sky, the way he sees this color, which I find for us very interesting. Anyhow, this is in Spanish, so I'm not going to try to translate it, but I just want to tell you what he says in a couple of letters. The most interesting ones about work, he says, the weather's not so good. Basically, he's out there in Valencia painting by the beach, not during the summer because it's too hot, plus he had work at the summer, so he's a little bit early. And he said, I just rented 2 oxes and a sailboat. He rented it, and he's asking people to take it to the beach. So I already arranged it. Tomorrow morning, they'll bring 2 oxes and a sailboat. And then he writes to her, oh no, in the morning, 7 in the morning, he's writing, the wind is coming from inland, so the sail is not going to be doing that. It's going to be going the opposite way. And then he says, there's no sun. Oh, the light is too gray. Oh, there's no wind. He said, there's no wind. And you keep seeing it. It says, November 27, November 26, and even on the 28th, so the next day, he says, bad wind. I'm not painting my oxes. And he's paying for this, so the people are like, well, yeah. And I remember one story about Chicharro, who was Sorolla's student, where he was saying, oh yeah, Sorolla also hired a donkey from some gypsies, but he wanted a brown, so the gypsy painted a gray horse brown and whatever. So this is all happening all the time. But what is interesting that he says to her, and the worst of all of this is that I am away from you all the time. It's so interesting. His children would write to him as well. So the letters from his daughter, from his son, once in a while, they would say, we went to a museum, we studying Egyptian art, whatever it is. And it's interesting about the relationship of a painter and wife, which I think is very similar to the Rubens, the nude painting, all of that. Sorolla really loved his wife, emotionally, spiritually, but very physically as well. And it's very clear on the letters that they had a clear physical attraction. And they talk about it. Once in a while, in this very formal style of writing back then in the 19th century, they get a little naughty sometimes, you can tell. And it's interesting. At one point, he writes a letter to her, which is incredible. I'm a painter, I'm a husband, and I'm a dad. And I don't think this way, but he says to her, I love my children, but you are more than that. It's like, wow. It's like you represent way more in my life. And he explains exactly what, and I'm not going to go in details, but it is just amazing, that connection. And he wrote to her, just to finish, in the morning, he would go painting, come back for lunch, he would write to her in the middle of the day, and then he would write to her also at night, and he would go for dinner or to the theater. He talks about going to see the Valkyria, Wagner, for the first time, and right after he writes back to her. So it's so connected, the connection. It just gives you a little bit of an idea.
That's beautiful, thank you. And then, so, as well as those paintings, there are, Helene, his second wife. We're back in Rubens as well, temporarily again now. We find her turning up in drawings and so on. It's not just portraits. He was using her as a model all the time. I think it's one of the reasons, perhaps, if you think about what Ramiro was just describing as well, also the fact that their wives are running the domestic part of their life. They thought that probably between assistants and everyone else, Rubens's house had 80 people working in it. Just imagine how many people that is to organize and how much time and energy that takes up. And so if you think about what a painter's wife did, it's one of the reasons it's not that surprising why there weren't that many female painters. A female painter couldn't have a wife. And think of the other jobs a painter's wife might have done, darning, maybe not for Rubens and Sorolla, they probably had staff, but other people who might have had to, you'd be darning socks, you'd be making food and all that other stuff. So the domestic reality of a painter's wife in those days made it very unlikely that they would have time to paint. The idea that these jobs were shared just didn't really exist back then. There might have been rare examples, but when you actually consider all the things that a painter's wife was expected to do, as well as model.
There's that idea of Artemisia who married a very mediocre painter.
Yeah.
So she was the painter, and he was running the house because he was just a mediocre painter. Yeah. That's one of the very rare exceptions. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting, the first, let's say, especially in the UK, which I know more about in terms of research, the first female artists to really reach a level of notoriety tend to be writers, and sometimes ceramicists, because it simply takes less time. So let's say amongst all your other duties, if you have 3 hours only, by the time you set up to paint oil and everything else, you've got maybe half an hour and you've got to tidy up as well. Whereas for a writer, the work is there. It isn't quite the same thing, and in ceramics is a little bit similar. Another beautiful drawing of his second wife. Just the different mediums involved as well. You can't really see it on this screen, but there's also the really subtle use of white chalk in this drawing, especially in the hands. This is, again, quite difficult to see, but this is a very kind of casual, quick drawing of himself and his wife kind of in the doorway to their house, kind of heading out to go and do something. I think sometimes perhaps it's in these really small, intimate things, a child down here, you get a sense of just how close they are. Even going back to that first portrait, the more formal one with the yellow stockings, like every time he paints himself with her, they're actually one shape. They're never standing apart. They're always overlapping in really quite a strong way. So he always presents them, even if they've got different tonalities or colors or costumes, they are one shape. Bit of cast drawing by Rubens. And so this is this other thing with Rubens' life. There's the domestic inspiration, and then there's the inspiration from the old masters. So this is in Stockholm, and this is again Rubens copying Titian. And just to get really close up, just to show you how wonderful he is in terms of brush handling. I probably don't need to sell you Rubens if you're here tonight, but why not just enjoy something like this? I find like a head like that just so compelling. Like the hair just being kind of a smudge of brown with a couple of little touches, compared to say a tree like that. That could easily be coral if you just cut out the top part. A flickering hand gesture. And then another one from lower down. Again, this thing that Rubens, what he always gives you, okay, here it's very obvious. It's this sort of tumbling, interweaving series of limbs and everything else. But even in his paintings that are nominally more still, there's this amazing feeling of movement. Okay, and so we're back with Sorolla again, and this is probably the first time in Sorolla's career where we really see Sorolla as Sorolla. This is kind of 1894. And if you shut your eyes and think of Sorolla painting, for me, it's the seaside, it's sparkling light, it's, as Ramiro was saying, cows and sails and people. But in a way, he was doing that to enable himself. He realized that these are a success. He enjoyed painting them, but actually all the time, his heart, in a funny way, was somewhere else. Here's a close-up of the paint.
One of his friends from the academy write this letter home or something like that. He says, there's classes at the academy start at 8 in the morning or 8:15, 8:30. Sorolla comes already from 2 hours of sketching with his sketches that he's done in the morning before starting class. I mean, that is Sorolla. And that's why he's so successful. And that's why he leaves his family, because he knows, I cannot do anything else but go out and paint.
I think also, I don't know whether you feel this too, but I think he married this girl who was much richer than him, and I think he felt this need to prove himself, and he had to, he really felt this need, like Zorn, I think as well, to earn money. He wanted to sort of cement it, he wanted that life. And so his own natural work ethic, allied to his desire to provide for his family, was such a powerful force.
And he achieved, Sorolla was one of the most successful painters of his time.
Phenomenally successful.
Hugely successful.
I think the other interesting dimension to it, I don't know how many of you know this, Sorolla was an orphan. Like his parents died when he was quite young. And I'm not going to talk too much about his social paintings tonight because it's a different theme, but I think this is a really important one to touch on. It's this very famous painting called Sad Inheritance. And again, this thing of where does subject matter come from? I think the thing with Sorolla was his subject matter nearly always came from things that touched him. So the fact that he was an orphan, but this was also, like, he was aware of this world. This is a group of, this is a photograph. I think it's actually taken by his father-in-law as well, on the beach in Valencia. And so as well as painting these scenes of, let's say the beach is a place of, okay, here it's a place of work. Other times we see the beach as a place of pleasure, but also he was aware of this side of life as well. He also painted people in carriages on their way to be executed or on the way to prison. And so there's a strong social conscience, which is also a really important dimension of Sorolla's work. I think, particularly when Ramiro was talking earlier about the way these figures are painted, I've always found almost like the lightning bolt type shape of this guy here, so pathetic in the sense of inducing pathos. You can't but feel for the fragility of this young boy sitting here, and other people enjoying it back here. But I think it's such a powerful and moving painting. And he also did these big kind of portrait commissions. I think this is perhaps where we don't see Sorolla at his best. To me, this is the group of people, the trustees for the El Greco Museum in Toledo, where we saw that painting on the bridge. Probably at this moment in time, if I had to choose a painter to paint this, I'd probably choose someone like Sargent. I think he had a slightly greater love for this kind of thing, or a facility for it. Whereas Sorolla's gifts, Sargent could never have painted this. Sargent could never have painted this in a million years, or his solutions would have been so much less interesting and varied, his sense of color. And then occasionally, you just sort of think, okay, yeah, it's fine. It's really impressive, but at the same time, when we look at this, we don't feel that sense of liveliness and passion and involvement that we do with other things. This is kind of fun. This is the Sorolla family at Christmas. So this is taken by his father-in-law. I'm pretty sure this is Sorolla down here on the bottom left. I think this is his wife here, and then so his father-in-law was this, already came from quite a well-to-do family, and had developed this method of both taking but also enlarging black and white photos. And one of Sorolla's early jobs, which Ramiro reminded me earlier, was actually tinting these things by color. So the precision, to an extent, we think of him as this great kind of virtuoso brushman. When you see his early work, but even that virtuoso brushwork is built on something very solid, very, very precise. And so he had this relationship with photography actually all his life. I think along with his study of the old masters, it really informed his sense of an understanding of composition. And he even wrote, he said, I'm studying Velázquez and I'm studying Titian and all these people, but I also, there's this other stream to my life, and there are certain paintings where that's more useful than that is. And I think that's a really interesting thing that he said. But he was able to say it as a result of studying rather than having not choosing to study it. So this is the Sorolla family all together. I think this is such an amazing picture. And it's also one of those paintings that sort of at first seems like nothing. And then the more you look at it, the more you realize how sophisticated the decision-making is. The first thing is that actually they've x-rayed this painting, and she used to look straight out. So he changed it and turned her head to profile. And just think about the relationship between mother and child, or we're looking at this as the father on the edge of the bed, as it were, standing or sitting. And so before, it was about the mother and father, and there happened to be the baby. Now it's really the father is kind of like a voyeur looking on at this scene. And so the painting either was originally called Mother, and he felt that this was much more about wife, or he turned the head and then changed the title. But anyway, at one point, this head was staring straight out. I didn't do it well enough to be able to show you on here, but I tried photoshopping it to take this line out and just either extending this across or that across. And the whole painting becomes, the space becomes meaningless. The other thing I tried doing was making this line higher. And you realize how important this arc is for the strength and the dynamism and the subtle movement of the whole composition. And so there are again, it seems like nothing. And then you suddenly realize in a painting like this, actually every decision and every change in temperature and color and value, it's not just about making something look realistic, it's also about actually just telling your eye where to go, how to move. And so this kind of seemingly casual, it's pretty much life, in the head is almost life-size, it's a big painting. So there's also this thing of this very intimate moment in the center of this kind of almost void. But actually one of the hardest things I think all of you guys who are doing final projects start to realize this, almost the hardest thing to paint is nothing. Backgrounds in that sense are probably the hardest thing. It's abstract painting because so much of it's technique to get the paint to work, but it's also just this thing of actually just arranging that space. And for me, that was probably I can remember being there thinking, hang on a minute, that line's really important. I got to try and work out why. And of course, this is where we're looking, but it's amazing how without those things, it's a little bit like in the Raphael Tondo they have in the Uffizi, in the Pitti now, and there's that chair leg, and you take that out and the whole thing just suddenly becomes like a sort of a vortex, which is very unstable and difficult to look at. And in a way, this is actually the thing that gives us that kind of reassuring thing of like, okay, this is where we are. So this is another portrait of his wife. I mean, lots of his portraits we're going to see, they come from Velasquez. I think this one's probably maybe a little bit more kind of, I don't know, even Goya, maybe even El Greco with the choice of the length of the body. Again, think about, we can look at a detail of the head in a second in terms of its simplicity, deceptive simplicity. Just think about the chair, all these other background elements, like where he's placed her in this. In a way, I suspect, he knew her face, he knew her body pretty well. So I would have thought that this was probably the easiest part of the whole painting. And again, when they've x-rayed it, they found that the things he was moving and repainting over and over again were the chair, where the painting should go. At one point, she was there, this was there, and there was more to that side, and so on. So this is the easy bit, in a way. Like, he had that motif so clearly, this is how I want you to go. The difficult bit was, how much of the chair do I show? Where does the painting go in the background? And so, again, it's that thing of, there's the idea of, like the likeness or the superficial thing of, like, let's say painting is photography of, like, this is what I see. But again, the more you study these painters and Sorolla, who, it seems like, compared to, say, a Rubens or a Van Dyck, it seems very casual. But actually, again, so much of the decision-making in this is about these secondary elements, not so much the idea of realism, but about the idea of, like, abstract arrangement. The choice of the yellow here against the yellow there. Just think about what all those shapes do. What would happen if she was leaning on, let's say, like a heavy dark brown piece of furniture? What would the painting look like then? Or what would its mood be in that case? Everything has a choice. He had this house full of wonderful furniture and objects. So he could have, anything. And if you go to the Sorolla house and you think of the possibilities he could have chosen, like, why did he choose that? And sometimes it's easy to read too much into these things, but I think there's it's very easy to see that level of confidence and intimacy between these two people. They know each other. And again, he also used his family. I think these are his daughters this time rather than his wife in these outsiders. This is when the family did come to the beach on one of those rare occasions, so he didn't have to write letters saying how much he missed them. Again, not so much portraits, but it's just so much easier maybe than if you're having to pay the donkey, pay the handler, pay the sale guy. Quite useful if some of your family would agree to sit for free. So I suspect sometimes there was even a financial logic to it as well. So this is his daughter this time, who became really ill. Again, this is part of a much bigger painting, and so they temporarily moved the family up into the hills above Madrid to help her get better. And his daughter, and actually his son as well, were both painters to some degree. This is Maria at the age of about 17, sketching outside. See the focused determination on that face. She's really looking. The other interesting thing is how, with Sorolla, some of his, let's say, bigger work, especially outside, seems so informal, and then his most intimate paintings are also some of his most formal. This is something I found really interesting. So this is a painting probably everyone knows or has seen either in these lectures or hopefully maybe one day in real life as well, Las Meninas. And so we're going to look at two portraits now of his sort of intimate family and how they've come out of that other one. So this is the second one. So so many different ways. First of all, it's the act of painting, the idea of the mirror here in the background, the boy down here, the little girl in the white dress in the center, the fact of a family group. So if we go back here, we have Velasquez painting. We have the king and the queen in the mirror, their daughter perhaps entertaining them or talking to them probably while they're being painted, and then the court life happening in the background. The action being in the kind of the lower half of the painting and this kind of gloom above with various objects in the background. And it's a different thing. It's a much more 19th century, it's an obviously 19th century interpretation of it. Here we have, basically it's black and white and a bit of ochre with touches of red, and suddenly the reds become a much more prominent field in the painting. But it's interesting how, particularly these rhythms of the hands are very related, I feel, in this as well. Again, it's such a touching portrait of, in fact, I think he's drawing her, or it feels like anyway, drawing his little sister's profile. And we can see the painter in the background. Is he working on this painting or another one? Again, that's pretty hard to know. And then this one here of his 3 children. Originally here, again, this is another painting that was x-rayed for the show in London. His wife was actually at one point sitting in front here. So the wife was actually painted out or taken out at some point. The obvious thing with Las Meninas here is the canvas on this side. So if we go back again, the famous thing here of just taking up half of this royal portrait with the back of a canvas, which is pretty brave, or never been done before in the history of royal portraiture. Here, obviously, it's a more intimate family thing. Interesting, like the color of the imprimatura, to see what he was painting on sometimes. He also used grays, blues, all sorts of different things. I mean, he wasn't formulaic in that way at all. And then again, the sort of the gloom behind objects in the background. And again, this intimate portrait of family life, the 2 girls in the red dresses. So again, that field of red rather than the little touches of red. And the sort of the informality of this girl with the sort of the more like the proud son standing there. I mean, to be the eldest son in a Spanish family is actually, particularly this time, and they were Sorolla was quite sort of conservative and old-fashioned in the sense of the importance of family. And I think you get every sense of the proudness of that young Spanish man standing there. I think he's wonderful. Well, he's got his hands in his pockets though, which maybe his mother wouldn't have liked. And this is the same boy, much younger. Again, it seems so sort of summary and casual, but again, even these kind of sketched in lines, I think this is the thing Ramiro was alluding to with those big sketches for the vision of Spain, the regions of Spain, is how he could make a small amount of time or a single brushstroke count. And so, even these lines here, which seem so kind of casual and sketchy, in the end, you kind of work out, you know exactly where his body is under here. Where it's drapery being drapery, where it's drapery telling us about, a wrist or, an elbow back there. And again, it's sort of this mix of, let's say, sort of quite formal, almost academic observation on one hand, and then this, this wonderfully spontaneous and confident use of the brush on the other. And Sorolla is a groundbreaking painter. I think perhaps we look more to these kind of images, the images at the seaside, the way that suddenly, if you think about how clearly and crisply he's thinking about external contours and edges and light and shadow, draw that with a pencil. But again, if you're actually at the sea, it's that idea of, when you see someone or an object in front of light like this on the water, you don't see the edge of someone. It's constantly moving and refracting. And so his idea of trying to paint, in a sense, honestly what he saw and then relating that to how he felt. And I think that's the amazing thing is when you feel when you see these paintings by the sea of just how excited he was by light. It's not the light of Velasquez, which is that sort of subtle gray, endlessly subtle, thing. Here, it's just the excitement of bright light. You described it once. I can't remember exactly the words you used.
Well, what happened was at that London exhibition, when we came out, I just had this thought. I thought, okay, Monet or the Impressionists painted the color of the light hitting an object.
Yeah.
How it changed on the object, but Sorolla is painting the quality of light, moving through life,
Yep.
So he didn't paint necessarily the color of the light, but the quality of the light, what light does.
Yeah.
And not necessarily the object. The object could have been anything, a children, an ox, a veil. It was the light. The light was the subject matter. That quality was amazing. That's the way I kind of saw it.
I mean, I find these so exciting because they're just so unformulaic. And it's the excitement of discovery, I think.
And it's interesting because the Impressionist already happened.
Yeah.
But he's not painting that at all.
No.
That's the Macchiaioli.
Yeah.
He's not interested in that at all. He has his own clear route.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And, same kind of thing. This is this is part of a young boy just kind of messing around in the mud, and just again the different ways he's using paint to describe things. But again, it's actually like the excitement of light on the underside of a foot, and just that thing of. I think with Sorolla, there's the love of family, the love of painting, and just taking sheer delight in the things he saw is one of the things I really get from looking at his work. The way that just the way that color changes, it goes through the blue to this, and then you have these wonderfully kind of buttery, heavy strokes. It's so wonderful. It's so exciting. And we're going to go back because for no particular reason, in terms of paintings of intimacy and paintings of family, I didn't feel I couldn't end on this. And I think it's one of the most touching and intimate child portraits, certainly in sort of Western art, I don't know enough about ever produced. I think it adds poignancy to it when you learn that this little girl who, according to legend, was destined to marry Van Dyck. She's a few years younger than him, died 5 years after this painting was painted. I think it's also interesting, someone like Rubens, who was obviously interested in, let's say, the sort of the hierarchies of social life and everything else. She's presented here without any jewelry, without a fine costume. It's just, again, a little bit like the portrait of Sorolla and his wife. We feel this incredible level of like engagement and love in the way that this young girl is looking at her father, and we look at her as if we're Rubens, and that's what I find so amazing with this. And I use it quite a lot in the lectures, but I'll end with it and say it again today. The guy that wrote the English dictionary is someone called Samuel Johnson, and he posed for Reynolds. And after the event, he wrote in his diary, he said, for me, like portrait painting can do three wonderful things. He said, in the moment, it either creates or deepens the bond between the artist and the sitter. Just think how this doesn't happen if you work from a photograph. He said, it also, when you see the portrait, it reminds you of a friend who's gone on a trip or isn't in the house at the time. And he said that a portrait also preserves the memory of the dead. And I think, when you look at this and you think of the excitement this young girl had sitting for her father and her engagement with that process and what happened to their relationship as well as this painting. He then had the painting when, he would have known this picture, she would have had it, and she would have remembered him if he wasn't in the house. And obviously it's, a reminder for the family, but also for, all of us of what happened both to her. But also, I think it tells us so much about Rubens as well. And that's, I think, a sad but actually a very happy place to end.